It's officially DC festival season, and we're super excited about this one coming up on May 18th. Africa on the Avenue is a celebration of the vibrant African immigrant community along Georgia Avenue Northwest. There's going to be interactive art installations, fashion shows, music, food, and local business stands. This one-day festival, organized by District Bridges' Lower Georgia Avenue Main Street program, truly has something for everyone. So I'll see you there on May 18th. Go to districtbridges.org to learn more. Today on CityCast DC, you might not think of DC as a gardening city, but gardening in the district actually offers some specific benefits you don't find elsewhere. Whether you've already got a green thumb or you're just getting started, Kathy Jentz, host of the podcast Garden DC, explains why you should be giving gardening a shot. Today's Thursday, May 2nd. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. So, Kathy, I was so excited to find out that there is a DC-based gardening expert and gardening-based podcaster in the mix. I think of myself as like an amateur gardener. I feel like DC might not be the kind of city that people expect to find gardening enthusiasts. What is it that you love about gardening in DC?
So we have a great climate here in the Washington, D.C. area. The Mid-Atlantic is like kind of the sweet spot between zones, between the coastal plain, which is the sandy soils on one side of 95, and the mountainous zone to the right, or I guess you would call it left side of 95 if you're looking at a map. And then, of course, we've got that nice climate that I recall once on the Daily Show, Jon Stewart saying, why can't everybody be like Maryland in that, we have the occasional hurricane, but we don't have earthquakes. We don't usually have ridiculous weather events.
Yeah. Are there other unique pluses to gardening in this area?
Definitely. So we have right in our backyard, literally, USDA is right here. So we've got so much plant science research being done in our area, and a lot of our wholesale growers are on the Eastern Shore and in Western Maryland. So you're able to source a lot of plants locally here in the Mid-Atlantic and on the East Coast. Whereas if you were in another part of the country, you're having a lot of that trucked in from elsewhere.
So I completely agree with you. I think that DC has a really nice climate. There are just things that make it feel right, and honestly, like, not that difficult to get into. What do you see as like maybe unique challenges to gardening in urban environments like DC?
I think number one that's coming up a lot for people who ask me is deer. So deer are encroaching more and more into human areas, and of course we're encroaching into their areas more, so that creates conflicts, right? So anybody who's living along like the Rock Creek corridor is feeling heavy deer pressure, and deer pretty much like to eat everything that we grow in our gardens, so that sets up a big conflict right there. The other biggest challenge I hear from people is mosquitoes. Unfortunately, they're just like at a certain point, you just don't want to even go outside, right? Anymore, with the heat and humidity and mosquitoes zapping you and biting you. But then in the shoulder seasons of spring and fall, it's just glorious out there.
Yeah, this is the best time. Last summer was a little tough because it was such a hot summer. And so I could really only be out at certain times, and I really wasn't giving my plants the tender loving care that they deserve. I was sort of like, it's too hot, I'll water tomorrow. It's too hot, I'll water tomorrow. And then you come out and you're like, it's all fried. But right now, this is a good time for folks to get started.
Exactly. So the mosquitoes have not emerged yet. It's perfect time to be out there. It's great balmy weather. Do wear your sunscreen because, Bridget, every spring around this time, I have a gardening friend or two who calls me and say, I got the worst sunburn because they overdid it right on that first glorious day of spring. They go out and they work for 5 to 8 hours or something. And I'm like, but you were inside all winter. And so you didn't really build up that immunity for that sunburn.
Yes, wear your sunscreen, listen to your body, all good advice. You were mentioning the rodents. I have the biggest problem. So I just have like a one-bedroom apartment in Columbia Heights, but I have a little I guess, back porch, you might say, that we've filled with plants. Our biggest problem is actually the squirrels. So, squirrels, what's so annoying is that they will dig up all the bulbs and then they don't even eat them. They just like leave them littered around the back patio, almost as if to taunt us. Like, hey, I dug up all your plants and I didn't even eat them.
hmm Yeah, they're doing that for a few reasons. One is sometimes they want the moisture. So if you can give them a water source somewhere else, and that's usually why you hear from a lot of people who have cherry tomatoes that the squirrels kind of like scrape out in the summertime. They don't like eating the tomatoes. What they're doing is they're going for that moisture. So they're kind of like, having those scrape marks on their tomatoes. And they're like, well, the squirrels scraped every one
Yes.
of my tomatoes but didn't eat them. And I'm like, that's because they're dying of thirst right there in the heat and humidity. But when they're digging up your bulbs and your annual flowers and then throwing them on the sidewalk and you come back at the end of the day and they're like half dead, that's never fun. But that's because they're making way for other things that they're burying in your pots and things. And in that case, I use like a hot pepper. It comes in spray form. You can also use the hot pepper flakes that you might even use on your pizza. Get that at the dollar store and sprinkle that on the surface. That discourages them from digging up stuff like that. They're lazy. They want to do the easiest thing possible. And your freshly potted up pots are the easiest thing for them to dig in versus hard soil in the ground, right?
Yes, we have a big thing of cayenne pepper, which we use that trick. It's pretty
hmm
effective. So for folks listening who were like, oh, this sounds lovely. I like the idea of starting my first garden in DC. Where should that person start?
So it depends on where you live. You might apply to DC Parks and Rec and see if there's a community garden spot available for you, if you're interested in vegetable gardening or growing herbs or anything like that. If you have balcony space, patio space that you can put some pots out on, that's a great place to start. If you don't, maybe talk to a relative who's maybe downsizing and they don't want to handle everything in their yard and say, can I put a bed here? Can I maintain these pots at your place? So that's another great alternative.
If you're living in Columbia Heights, you can check out the Columbia Heights Green, which I think is on 11th Street, which is very cute. And I guess I would always say, like, folks might be surprised. You don't really need that much space to get started. Like, you need less space than you might think.
hmm And starting smaller is always wiser because we love to like to go whole hog when we garden. We want to plant everything
Hmm.
all at once. So I think being limited is a good thing at first to a few spots or a few pots or just like a 10 by 10 plot can limit you for so you don't burn out later on.
Everybody knows that getting that perfect Mother's Day gift is basically impossible, but we promise Mom will love this one. The Capitol Hill Restoration Society House and Garden Tour is back this Mother's Day weekend on May 11th and May 12th. Tour 9 elaborate homes and gardens and 3 historic buildings on Capitol Hill that you can't normally enter. And if you can't make it, check out the Capitol Hill Restoration Society's other events like walking tours and monthly preservation cafes. You can buy tickets for the Mother's Day House and Garden Tour on Eventbrite, and be sure to follow CHRS on Facebook and Instagram at Capitol Hill Restoration DC. Hey DC, one of the reasons hosting this show is so important to me is this statistic from the US Surgeon General. Ready for it? The percentage of Americans who report feeling very attached to their community is only 16%. Now, there's a lot of ways to look at that number, which, by the way, is pre-pandemic data, but here's how I'm thinking about it. CityCast DC is something that we're building to make it easier for you to feel attached to this community. I don't want anyone to feel lonely or bored here in DC. I want you to know how you can help make this city more fun and more livable, and where all the good local stuff is at. And if you think we're doing a good job, I'm asking if you'll become a member of CityCast DC today at membership.citycast.fm. You'll get exclusive perks like ad-free listening, event invites, and members-only guides. But most of all, you'll be part of a project dedicated to making the number of DC residents who feel attached to this community a heck of a lot higher than 16%. See you over at membership.citycast.fm, and thank you. So if you are gardening in a small space that doesn't get a lot of sunlight or doesn't have a lot of space, what are some good things to start with in an apartment?
So it depends if you want to do edibles or ornamentals, but if you're looking for edible plants with low light and just a little bit of space, I would say you can go for any of the leafy greens. So those could be lettuces, arugula. Then you could also go to the leafy green type herbs like cilantro and parsley, do well in those conditions. And if you're looking for ornamental, then you might want to look on the shade perennials and shade annuals. So that could be right now, pansies and alyssum would be a nice little combination for a pot.
Oh, that would be lovely. I have a theory. This is like a personal theory. I'm curious your thoughts. When I first got started with gardening, the first thing I wanted to do was get one of those like potted tomato plants from the store. And I was like, oh, I'm going to have tomatoes. Something about that is like very satisfying. But when I tell you, I think I went through 3 different versions of those potted tomato plants and not a one lasted. I feel like it feels satisfying to start, but it might be like too high of a barrier to be, starting in a small space with a tomato plant. What are your thoughts on that?
That can be successful, but I always say, again, start small. So you want to start with a little seedling and put that in your pot and then nurture that to grow rather than like a full-blown tomato plant with a couple tomatoes already on there. I'll see people, succumb to that at the store and they're like, ooh, I already got a head start.
So enticing.
Very enticing. However, you're supposed to prune off the flowers and fruit when you transplant it, and nobody does that because who would sacrifice those, right? But then that's not telling the plant, I've been moved, I've been transplanted into a new spot, I need to develop new roots and then send out my flowers and fruit.
Ooh, I am guilty. I needed to hear this advice when I was trying to work with those tomato plants. Like, as a seasoned gardener, do you have any other tips and tricks like that folks should be thinking about when they're planting?
Yeah, so again, if you're planting just a couple pots of things, think about combinations and, the principle of right plant, right place. So things in pots together should be complementary. So all shade lovers together, all moisture lovers together. If you're doing like a desert or a tropical pot, I wouldn't combine, say, succulents with a banana, right? Because they both want full sun, but one wants a lot less moisture than the other. So that's really the principles to stick by and plan around.
What are some of the more difficult but maybe rewarding things that you've grown in the area?
I think some of the most difficult are things like eggplant, where it's just like every creature, every fungus wants to attack an eggplant. So getting a few nice sized eggplant on your little plant is always a victory because you're going to get attacked by several different things. Corn is another one that I'm like, every creature wants your corn stalks. As soon as your corn starts to develop, every raccoon in the area, every other rodent, all the birds, other people.
I was going to say, if you were growing corn and eggplant, you might find me out there like, ooh, what is this?
Yeah, there's always that as well. I've had a couple watermelons stolen out of my vegetable plot. That's, never fun for that to happen. When it's animals, it's almost more understandable. But when it's other people, it's highly disappointing.
What are because if you're growing that level of enticing vegetation in like your yard or a garden, I could understand why someone would, poke around in there. Have you had any other like weird experiences with human pests getting into your garden?
Yeah, I have a little patch of sunflowers that I plant out on my corner, what I call the hell strip. So that's like the strip between the sidewalk and the street that's usually compacted and very polluted, has road salt and everything. So sunflowers are a great plant to remediate in there. But I've come across people just trying to yank them out of the ground and walk off with them. And I'm like, that's not how it works.
And just like walking off with it, like, oh, this is mine now. I just found it in the ground. It's mine, right?
Yeah.
Is there anything specifically that folks should not grow in DC? Maybe not because it's challenging, but because like it's just not a good thing to have in the area?
Yeah, so there's a list of invasive species that you can check. The Maryland and Virginia departments of agriculture and then the parks departments will have those lists for you. And those are usually not things you're going to find at your local garden center, but those would be things that might escape your garden and go into the local forests and invade there or take the place of some native plants. But generally anything on the invasive species list.
So is there a pretty big gardening community in DC? Like if somebody was interested in learning more or just like being more involved in gardening, what should they check out?
Yeah, so there are lots of groups you can join, lots of local garden clubs. The Rooting DC annual conference moves around to different locations every year. And so Rooting DC, over 1,000 people come. There's tables, there's talks, everything is volunteer run and free. So it's a great place to start with your garden education. And then there's, of course, all our wonderful public gardens in the area. So you can start with U.S. National Arboretum, U.S. Botanic Garden. The National Mall has classes that they offer, and many of them are for free. So you can just go on the usbg.gov website and look for their Friday noon classes. And then Smithsonian Gardens does, I believe, every Thursday at noon, and many of those are recorded and put on their YouTube channel. So all of that is free and open information and a great way to connect to other local gardeners.
Well, Kathy, thank you so much for being here. And folks, be sure to check out Kathy's podcast, Garden DC. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell your garden-obsessed friend? You can rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news from around the city. Talk to you then.
And it's not till you get your own place that you go a little crazy. So I bought a little condo with a walkout patio in Wheaton, Maryland, and I started to garden up a storm and into the common area. And then the owners association was like, Kathy, that's not yours. They were like, we love what you do. It's gorgeous. We love all the flowers, but no,